Hello everyone, my name is Simon Chadwick. I am one of the editors of GeoSport and also a professor of Eurasian sport at EM Lyon Business School in France. I am really happy today to have two people whose work I avidly follow and I'm a big fan of. We have Kristian Ulrichsen, who is from Rice University in the United States, and also Andrea Krieg, from King's College in London. Thank you both for being with us today. We're here to talk essentially about the Gulf Cooperation Council and relations between specifically Saudi Arabia and Qatar. As many people watching this will know, in 2017, Saudi Arabia terminated diplomatic relations with Qatar. And subsequent to that, there has been a bitter relationship between the two, interspersed with episodes that have had significant consequences for sport. And in one episode in particular, during 2020, the summer of 2020, as many people will now know, Saudi Arabia made an attempt to acquire Newcastle United of the Premier League. And that immediately became intertwined and embroiled with a World Trade Organization investigation into the broadcaster beOut, or the pirate broadcaster beOut and Qatar's beIN Sport. Now, I hope that we'll talk a little bit more about such cases in due course. But what we're also going to do today is to talk a little more generally about the nature of relations in the Gulf and between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So if I could start with you, Kristian, I think a lot of people who suddenly became, I think during 2017 and 2020, a lot of people suddenly became geopolitical experts. And I think there were a lot of football fans in particular became geopolitical experts and were suddenly, had these incredible insights into the GCC and into relations between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And I think, just to begin with, it would be good if you could, Kristian, tell us a little bit more about, longer term, more historically, what is the nature of the relationship between the two countries and what is the GCC and where did it come from?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, Simon. And it's a pleasure to be on the podcast. As you noted, the GCC stands for the Gulf Cooperation Council. It was formed in 1981. It's a group of 6 states on the Arabian Peninsula: Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, that many people will know for Dubai and Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman. And those 6 states came together in a sort of loose organization in early 1981 in response to several regional shocks, the aftermath of the revolution in Iran that swept away the Shah at the end of 1979, and then the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War a year later in 1980 when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. And so the monarchies, they're all monarchies in the Gulf, they sort of came together thinking that together they were at least stronger as a collective unit, but a loose collective unit. One of the challenges of the GCC is that Saudi Arabia is so much larger than the other 5 countries. Now, even within the other 5 countries, there are variations. Qatar and Bahrain are much smaller, for example, than Oman and even the UAE. But there is an imbalance of size, both in territory, in population, and in conventional military power as well, and political and economic power too. And Saudi Arabia has always seen itself as very much the sort of regional leader as well. And periodically, at various points in the 19th and 20th centuries, Saudi Arabia had territorial claims on pretty much every other Gulf state on the Arabian Peninsula. At one point, Saudi leaders had territorial claims on parts of the Qatari Peninsula. The Saudis blockaded Kuwait for 14 years in the 1920s and 30s. There was quite a bitter territorial dispute between Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi in the 1950s and again in the 1970s. Periodic tension between Saudi and Oman, And Bahrain these days is more of a Saudi kind of sphere of influence, heavily under Saudi political, economic, and security influence. 75% of Bahrain's oil, for example, comes from an oil field that the Saudis allow the Bahrainis to access and to use for their own purposes. So there's always been an imbalance between Saudi Arabia and the other 5 Gulf states. And that has led to tensions when some of the smaller Gulf states have tried to carve out their own niche for themselves. The concern for the smaller Gulf states is that people across the world, in London or in DC or in Brussels, look at the Gulf and look at Saudi Arabia and see Saudi plus 5 small states that we don't know much about. And so both Qatar and the UAE, Abu Dhabi and Dubai, beginning from the 1990s, really began to try and project themselves onto the regional international stage as powers in their own right, to try and escape the Saudi shadow in a way. And one of the lessons that small states learned was that of Kuwait in 1990, when Kuwait was invaded by the Iraqis. The international community very quickly mobilized to liberate Kuwait. And we're talking today on the 15th of January, the 30th anniversary of the start of the Gulf War. And the lesson for small states in a volatile region that has seen 3 major wars since 1980, the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War of 1991, the Iraq invasion of 2003, for the smaller states surrounded by larger powers, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, it made sense to build out your international profile, to create international partnerships and linkages, so that if the worst came to the worst, as in Kuwait in 1990, and something happened, you would have partners that would quickly mobilize and come to your support. And so Qatar began to do that with liquefied natural gas, with energy linkages, with countries around the world. Abu Dhabi and Dubai became much more high profile for different reasons as well. And so gradually you had this rise of the smaller Gulf states, which again caused periodic tensions with Saudi Arabia, just because the Saudis were so used to having a regional leadership role. And then just more recently in 2011, we had the Arab Spring. We had political upheaval in Bahrain, especially prolonged uprising in Bahrain. The Saudis and the Emiratis closed ranks. They saw anything that threatened the status quo as a threat to their stability and security. Qatar was more open to political change in North Africa, in Syria, for example. Al Jazeera, which is Qatar-based, provided coverage of the uprisings in Egypt and Libya and elsewhere. And that really created a new geopolitical edge, in the sense that the Saudis and Emiratis were determined to try and close down some of the political spaces that had opened up in 2011. And in 2012, for example, Egypt elected a president from the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Qatari government supported the Egyptian government in that year quite heavily in political and financial support. And then in 2013, that Egyptian president was toppled in a military coup, which the Saudis and Emiratis immediately supported with their own support. And so after 2013, we began to see more of a geopolitical struggle, also for the pace and direction of change post-Arab Spring too. And the Saudis and Emiratis were quite determined to at least make sure that nothing could threaten the status quo in the same way as it had in 2011 for a time in 2011 to 2013.
So thank you, Kristian. Andreas, obviously there was a flashpoint in 2017. There'd been a flashpoint too in 2014 between Saudi Arabia and Qatar as well. Could you perhaps take us through from 2014 to 17? What was happening between Saudi Arabia and Qatar at that point?
Well, as Kristian already rightly said, this goes way beyond 2014. There have been always these little eruptions throughout history between Saudi and Qatar, as well as between Saudi and its other neighbors. The difference is, though, that Qatar, unlike, for example, the UAE, for a very, very long time was a country that bandwagoned along the Saudis more than others, and it was really the transformation of Qatar under its, the current father emirs, which is the father of the current emir, Hamad bin Khalifa, to kind of, as Kristian already said, kind of push Qatar to emerge from the shadow of Saudi Arabia, exploring new avenues to make Qatar more independent and get its own independent standing in the region, outside and independent of Saudi Arabia, and in many ways actually taking views which were 180 degrees opposed to Saudi Arabia. So, you know, whether it was on Islam, on education, on social reforms. So all these issues really played into that relationship since the early mid 1990s, when Hamad bin Khalifa became the emir. And, you know, there was a coup d'etat attempt against Hamad bin Khalifa, which was orchestrated by the same three countries that were blockading Qatar in 2017, again, led by the Saudis and the Emiratis with Bahraini support. So, you know, there's a legacy there. And obviously, there's been a period already in the early 2000s as well, where the Saudis withdrew their ambassador from Qatar because it was mostly about you know, their disagreement about the coverage that they were getting at Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera became such particularly for the Saudis, the most important problem when it comes to these bilateral relations. They were seen as a nuisance, and more so potentially a mobilizing force within Saudi Arabia against the Al Saud leadership. So Al Jazeera was always seen as a means, because it was covering all kinds of topics and was giving a platform to individuals that would have never been able to get a platform in the Gulf before. Some of them were opposition forces from Saudi Arabia, and in that way, the Saudis always saw Al Jazeera as a means for Qatar to penetrate and mobilize potential dissidents within Saudi Arabia. So Al Jazeera was always kind of that problem factor in that relationship. Moving fast forward, so we had the 2000s, we had diplomatic rifts that were eventually healed, and the Saudi ambassador would return to Qatar. And then the real Gulf crisis prelude to the 2017 episode was really 2014, as you rightly say. In 2014, I was living in Qatar at the time. And when, you know, it came pretty much overnight. It was a withdrawal of the ambassadors. It was mostly in response to Qatar's behavior during the Arab Spring, as Kristian already said, about Qatar's support for non-state actors, Qatar's support for the revolution, and Qatar's support for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and other Islamist forces throughout the Arab Spring. And that was in many ways the real prelude to 2017, because the ideational, ontological underpinnings of that episode in 2014 were the same ones that we saw in 2017. So it was fundamentally, again, about how the Saudis, and not just the Saudis, because at that time in 2014, it was also the Emiratis. And I'd probably say it was even more driven by the Emiratis than by the Saudis, their disagreement about the role of Qatar in the region. And it was really, I always say it's a war over narratives and a war over ideology of how to restructure the Arab world post-Arab Spring. So, you know, in simple terms, obviously all these six countries are non-democratic. They are tribally based monarchies, but there are differences, you know, nuances in terms of social liberalism and political liberalism. And Qatar generally had supported a bit more of a liberal approach to civil society domestically in Qatar, but definitely across the Arab world against authoritarian regimes. So, you know, Hamad bin Khalifa, the father emir, and then also Tamim bin Hamad is the current emir of Qatar, very much supported anti-authoritarian movements and tried to mobilize them. That was seen as a drastic issue for the Emiratis, more so than for the Saudis, but obviously the Saudis jumped onto that bandwagon as well. And we also have to talk about, when we talk about 2014, which again started with the withdrawal of the ambassadors of the UAE, Saudi, Bahrain, and Egypt, the same four countries that also withdrew the ambassadors and started the blockade against Qatar in 2017. We also have to talk about Egypt again, because that was Kristian already alluded to. The issue with Egypt was that the Emiratis and the Qataris started off the Arab Spring on more or less the same side in Libya. They're supporting the NATO operation. Nobody really knew where this was going. Nobody knew how the post-revolutionary environment would play out. The Qataris were very idealistic in thinking, if we topple the regimes, we can build something sustainable in terms of social politics for the region. And that suddenly in 2013 looked like was no longer possible. So we see a counter-revolutionary wave. We see some of these rebel groups disintegrating, some of the united fronts of rebel groups against the old regimes disintegrating, and it looked increasingly chaotic. And it was in that time, in 2013, that the Emiratis saw an opportunity to say, especially in Egypt, to kind of win back Egypt from what they saw as a Muslim Brotherhood led entity, which the Qataris had supported. And with, massive capital, but also, intelligence operations, mobilization on the ground, the Emiratis were very crucial in kind of allowing the military coup against Egypt in 2013. And it showed them that whatever the Qataris had started in 2011 was not sustainable and could be attacked. And that kind of, in 2014, they suddenly emerged, the Emiratis, with immense confidence, while the Saudis were ambiguous in the Arab Spring because they were supporting the rebel groups against the Assad regime in Syria, while being more neutral on things happening in North Africa and being opposing the Arab Spring in Bahrain. Overall, the Saudis were ambiguous. The Emiratis were very firm of saying, if we want stability in the region, it needs to be one of authoritarian stability. It shouldn't be the empowerment of non-state actors or the mobilization of rebel groups and dissidents. They need to be silenced. We need to curb civil society where possible. And they had the confidence in 2014, the Emiratis, to say, let's go for it. Let's go and isolate the Qataris. Let's pressure them, particularly as the new Emir Tamim came into power just a year earlier in 2013. So Qatar was still in this at that moment, first of all, at a breaking or a pivotal point in the Arab Spring, where the revolutions kind of lost track and traction and lost mobilization power. A new emir, very young Tamim bin Hamad, came into power, and at the time, the Emiratis thought they could pressure the Qataris into submission and stopping their support for non-state actors, B, their support for dissidents and civil societal actors and NGOs across the region, and third, isolate also Al Jazeera and also silence Al Jazeera as much as they were seeing this as a nuisance across the region. So and that is what led to that crisis in 2014. They came to an agreement in Riyadh, the so-called Riyadh Agreement, where both sides signed a communique, which was in very loose terms about non-interference, sovereignty, but didn't really stipulate the details. So Qatar never firmly said they would close down Al Jazeera. They never said they would stop engaging with non-state actors and dissident groups across the region. But there was a commitment of saying we don't interfere. No side interferes in the internal affairs of the neighbors, and that was committed. All sides committed to. But it only went that far, because if it had been up for the Emiratis, up to the Emiratis, they would have wanted to almost topple the regime and create a vassal state of Qatar in 2014. And it was the Saudis who broke rank and kind of pushed for a rapprochement and a unification in the GCC in 2014, very much against the interest of the elites in Abu Dhabi who are leading the Emirates. So that is kind of the pretext to the crisis that then followed in 2017.
Okay, so given what happened in 2017, we obviously then went through nearly 4 years of as I say, sometimes bitter feuding between the two sides. Kristian, can I ask you, are there particular highlights or particular instances that you think are significant in that period of time that people should really be aware of? And I know we talked a little bit as we were preparing for this around social media, for example, as being a medium through which a proxy war seemed to be taking place. Maybe you could tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, I'd just like to first just pick up on just a couple of things that Andreas rightly mentioned. And one thing Andreas talked about was the Emirati confidence in 2014. And I would also say that Qatar in 2011, when the Arab Spring began, Qatar had been awarded the World Cup hosting rights 2 weeks before the Arab Spring began. December the 2nd, 2010, the Qataris were awarded the rights for the World Cup. December the 17th, we had the Tunisian street vendor setting himself on fire, which triggered a chain of events. And so Qatari self-confidence also was very high in 2011, having successfully campaigned for the World Cup. There may have been a feeling that we can achieve whatever we can just by putting enough resources behind an issue. And so that could have led to a degree of overreach. I mean, Qatar's self-confidence at least was at a peak in early 2011. And then the other thing that Andreas mentioned again about the change from the father Emir to Emir Tamim in June 2013, that was 8 days before the coup in Egypt that toppled Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president. So effectively, from the first week that Emir Tamim came to power, he's been faced with the fallout from Qatar's Arab Spring policies 2011 to 2013, in the sense that the Emiratis, the Saudis, decided straight away to push back and push back really hard. And so for the entire duration, beginning a week into his rule, that's been a feature that the Qatari leadership since 2013 has had to face. And as Andreas said, 2013 led to a dispute in 2014. The Riyadh Agreement was signed in November 2014. In June 2017, Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt went further than they did in 2014. They not only withdrew diplomatic representation, they also imposed a political and economic boycott or blockades, depending on which side of the argument you fall on Qatar. Once again, they accused Qatar of being a threat to regional security and stability. The 2014 agreement, which Andreas rightly mentioned, a lack of commitments, itself became an issue of contestation because it was then leaked to the media. And the Emiratis and Saudis accused the Qataris of breaching it, although one could also argue that the breachers were the Saudis and Emiratis because they were the ones who are now trying to interfere in Qatari internal affairs by sponsoring potential threats to the ruling family in Qatar. They found a couple of Qatari members of the royal family who were living in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and tried to present them as alternative emirs of Qatar. And their grandfathers had been previous emirs, and so they were sort of from distant branches of once ruling figures. Straight away, the dispute became bitter, it became personal, whereas 2014 and previous Gulf disputes had been between leaderships. They had been solved at a leadership level by agreements. This one immediately touched and hit directly on families and communities because borders were closed, people were given 2 weeks to leave, families were split because in the Gulf, as Andreas rightly said, the tribal structure means families are spread across multiple states, extended families. So they couldn't visit each other. People would miss weddings and funerals and births and all family events. They couldn't even speak to each other without suspicion in some cases. So straight away, the crisis of 2017 included and encompassed society, it wasn't just a political issue as well. And as you said, social media became a tool of abuse, a tool of trying to, as Andreas has said, steamroller a particular narrative one way or the other. It became very personal, very bitter. And as part of this, we had individual issues becoming used or trying to become sticks with which the states blockading Qatar could try and annoy and poke the Qataris. And for the purposes of sport, one, of course, was, as you mentioned, be out Q. Now, the Premier League rights for the Middle East are held by a company called beIN. And beIN was initially Al Jazeera Sport. It was then rebranded in 2013. And so this is an extension of the whole Al Jazeera dynamic that Andreas was talking about, that the Saudis and Emiratis were especially mistrustful of. And so in 2017, a pirate channel calling itself Be Out Q, a clear allusion to Qatar and to the blockade, started pirating all the sports content that beIN was doing. And I think at that point, it was just another way of trying to hit out at Qatar. There were other issues. There was an attempt to try and manipulate the Qatari currency to create economic and financial instability. There were comments by people in the UAE that the blockade was designed to get the World Cup taken away from Qatar, the World Cup being, of course, the most prestigious event that the Qataris were going to hold. There was an attempt to try and expand the World Cup from 32 to 48 teams, which had already been agreed for 2026, but there was an attempt to try and bring it forward to 2022 on the assumption that Qatar is too small a country to host 48 teams. And so by expanding ahead of schedule, there would have to be sharing the World Cup with other countries like Saudi or UAE. So there were a number of issues that became part of this, became drawn into the dispute as ways to try and poke and to try and score political points. And of course, as you know, as you mentioned at the beginning, Be Out Q then became a big issue in 2020 with the potential attempt to take over Newcastle. Now, I suspect that in 2017, nobody in Riyadh was thinking, well, we might want to buy a Premier League team 3 years down the line. Is this a good idea or not? At that time, it was just, this is a high-profile Qatari entity, beIN. This is how we can try and disrupt some of their services as part of the attempt to try and isolate Qatar and to score points. And so we saw a lot of that over the last 3 years. There had been a hope in Saudi Arabia and in Abu Dhabi that the US government would support them. And of course, Donald Trump initially did tweet in support. But the miscalculation that was made was that if Donald Trump changed sides, the entire US government would change sides as well. And what we saw in June 2017 were the Secretaries of State and Defense, and also the US military, which has its biggest regional base in Qatar. It's a kind of launching pad for all US military operations in Afghanistan and around the region. They were telling Donald Trump, you can't take sides. This is not a kind of US-Iran situation where one side is the good side, the other side is the bad side. These are all of our partners. And so by September 2017, we were in this kind of holding pattern where the US government had made it clear that they wanted the issue resolved. They wouldn't take sides. But by that point, the crisis was so deeply entrenched that no one side wanted to be the one that would back away first and make concessions. And so that's why we had that standoff from approximately mid-2017 until fairly recently, because no one side wanted to be the one that would acknowledge that perhaps they made a mistake. And so we had that sort of 3 years of trying to score points through other means, through Be Out Q, through the World Cup and point scoring. So that's where it developed until pretty recently.
So what changed, Andreas? So as we headed towards the end of 2020 and into 2021, what do you think was happening in the Gulf, and why did we suddenly see what to me at least seemed a very quick change in direction, although obviously that had been simmering for some time? What was going on? What happened?
So, as Kristian rightly said, I mean, this whole effort by the US government to get this resolved started probably summer 2019, where the Trump administration became more sincere to actually bring both sides together. And as I initially said, the real ontological, ideological division in the Gulf, which is about the future of the region, is between two states, right? It's between the UAE and Qatar. Saudi was always somewhat ambiguous, although, with the change of power towards Mohammed bin Salman, it became a lot closer aligned to the UAE. And in many ways, if you look at some of the policy decisions, it was no longer that Saudi was the big brother that was kind of giving other countries they're providing them with the freedom to maneuver. It was the Emiratis who were basically mentoring now the Saudis under Mohammed bin Salman. So this change of leadership is very important in Saudi Arabia as well, because it also revolved around a certain group of individuals that now made decisions, and as Kristian said, made decisions not really in a strategic manner. Everything that was done within Saudi under Mohammed bin Salman was very impulsive. Mohammed bin Salman had ousted an entire legacy of institutional knowledge that had been built up over decades by removing certain people that he thought would be a threat to his own regime. He put people in power, in charge, that were in no way qualified for the roles that they were filling. One of these individuals was Turki al-Sheikh. Another individual was his minister of communication. God, I now forgot his name because he disappeared. Help me out, Kristian. His social media boss.
Yeah, Saud al-Qahtani.
Yeah, Saud al-Qahtani, exactly. So these are just two individuals who were very, very close, who were personal friends of the Crown Prince, who suddenly had very strategic positions in, on one hand in the sports arena, because they saw sport as a means of sport diplomacy. Saudi wanted to kind of create and build itself up as a regional leader in the sports world. So obviously the FIFA World Cup in Qatar was something that they didn't want to accept. They also wanted themselves to be a hub for entertainment, not just for the domestic audience, because there's this element of bread and circuses. While Saudi is still undergoing massive social political changes and socioeconomic changes, at least there was a bit of liberalization where people were saying, look, you can now go to entertainment events. Sports was a very important component part of basically binding the masses to the new regime around Mohammed bin Salman. So Saudi has been in a state of crisis and instability ever since 2017. The Emiratis, on the other hand, have really used that initiative or that void that Saudi has left to kind of expand in terms of size. They're still a small state by most metrics, but if you look at their reach and strategic depth in the Horn of Africa, in North Africa, and the Levant, the UAE are arguably one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful state in the Arab world these days. And it was the problem was always between these two competing small states, Qatar and the UAE, and they were competing about in the soft power realm for the most part, right? It was about access in Washington, access to markets. It was about sports diplomacy as well, right? Dubai has Expo, had Expo 2020, which is now Expo 2021. You had Qatar with a World Cup. They were competing as hosts for all kinds of events. Both of them were kind of marketing themselves as being different from Saudi, more liberal, more inviting to overseas visitors and tourists. So this is really where the conflict was, right, between UAE and the Emiratis, UAE and the Qataris. And the Americans understood in 2019 that something needed to happen. They wanted to realign the Gulf vis-a-vis the Iranians. And they understood that the Emiratis and the Qataris were so far apart from one another in this conflict that I was describing before, which is an ideological one, that they understood that it would be impossible or near impossible to bring all these parties around the table. And they said any mediation initiative or effort that we're making has to be focused on the Qataris and the Saudis, because they're the most likely to come around and make some concessions. And this process was an 18-month process. And we've seen certain ups and downs. We had in November 2019, we were very close to a breakthrough where they're already saying, okay, both sides are talking to one another. There is an avenue out of it. But then, it was again the Emiratis throughout that process who've tried to somewhat undermine this. They put a lot of pressure on MBS saying, we don't want you to make any concessions to the Qataris as of yet. That was in November 2019. They then used the Bahrainis, because apart from the fact that Bahrain is a country that is very much under Saudi influence, we've seen over the last couple of months or maybe past year, the Emiratis really building more and more relationships and networks in that country, particularly with the new crown prince. There is a lot of financial depth that goes into Bahrain. So Bahrain has become somewhat of a proxy for the Emiratis as well, to kind of sabotage that process of alignment. But what really changed was then the election of Joe Biden in November. That kind of signaled that there would be a wind of change coming from Washington, and Washington was always the key audience for that media theater and spectacle in the Gulf. It was the Trump administration that was the target of all these war over narratives that we saw on social media, that we saw in the media and among think tanks in Europe, in the UK, and also in Washington. And now Trump being gone, and Biden coming in with a very, very different view on the Gulf. First of all, he doesn't seem to value the Gulf as much as Trump. He's also someone who believes that China is more important, that the focus of US policy should not be on that region. It should be into the Asia Pacific. Iran would be more confronted through rapprochement or engagement rather than confrontation. So in that kind of context, the Saudis knew that this new administration would not be as favorable, wouldn't look as favorably on Riyadh as the Trump administration did. And so they had to kind of build up some sort of political credit as well ahead of that change in Washington. And so in November, when it became clear Biden came in, we saw the Saudis really, really committing to that mediation process by the Trump administration. It allowed, on the one hand, suggesting to Trump that, look, we're making concessions, while Trump also wanted Saudi to make more concessions when it came to normalization with Israel, which Saudi didn't want to do, but they said at least we're doing it on the Qatar portfolio. They wanted to see more commitment from Saudi on the Yemen portfolio. Again, very difficult for MBS. So the Qatar portfolio was one where he could buy political credit in Washington very quickly without any painful concessions. And I would say that by 2020, if not by 2019 already, the costs of that blockade for Saudi were immensely higher than any of the benefits that they could reap. And the media campaign hurt Saudi more than any other country. We talked about, Be Out Q and the Be in Sport scandal last year in the UK. There's a great case to be made that the entire, the media attention around that case of Being Sports, which was very well pushed by the Qataris to say, look, is that the kind of country you want to do business with, Saudi Arabia, who are now basically stealing rights, footballing and commercial rights from the Premier League? Is that the country that you want to sell this football club to? And all that, media debate around this issue definitely led to the fact that, that people reconsidered. There's a good point to be made that the Saudis thought they lost that case, that bid with Newcastle United because of that media campaign. But that goes beyond. It's not just Newcastle. It's on a variety of different issues. The whole Khashoggi affair, again, having the Qataris on the other side of that divide, shooting against Saudi Arabia was definitely not something that the Saudis could sustain. So the idea was, let's make a commitment. Let's try to bring this to an end. We can buy credit in Washington. We'll bring it effectively a conflict to an end that doesn't serve our national interest anymore, Saudi interest. And that also explains why the Saudis went so quick to actually mend ties with the Qataris, despite the fact that the Qataris effectively didn't make any concessions. The Qatari concessions that they made have to all be viewed within the context of the crisis of 2017. So the Qataris are now saying we're dropping all legal cases against the neighboring countries, but these legal cases only emerged because of the crisis. They were also saying, the Qataris are now saying we're going to tone down our media coverage and negative coverage of Saudi Arabia to a certain extent. Again, I would make the case that the Qataris became so anti-Saudi because of the blockade. I think if the blockade hadn't started in the first place, we wouldn't have seen an escalation in that way. And I'm also very skeptical to what extent Al Jazeera can tone down its coverage because they have a certain reputation to lose. And I do think that in many ways they will balance their coverage a bit more. But there are certain issues on Saudi Arabia which are in the international light and international attention, where all other news outlets will also cover Saudi very negatively, where I can't see how Al Jazeera will take an outsider approach and say, no, there is no problem, there's nothing to see here. So it will be difficult. And so what I'm getting at is the Qataris made almost no concessions. They got away with basically the blockade being lifted. These demands that were raised, which were never to be fulfilled, these 13 demands, which were all over the place and basically asked from Qatar to become a vassal state of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. These demands have vanished and evaporated, nothing to be heard of. And now Qatar, most commentators would say Qatar came out of this as the absolute winning party. And as Kristian rightly says in his book, Qatar came out as a very resilient country as well. It has diversified its ties internationally. It has new trade routes. It has a much better reputational standing, I would say, than they had in 2017. They've actively worked to sell themselves and show themselves in terms of public diplomacy, who they are, what they're doing, why they're doing it, became more transparent, really cut some of their ties to non-state actors in the region. So all that taken together, we see the Saudis saying, okay, we need to make a concession here. They did make a concession, and it's a Saudi-Qatari initiative, and that's how we have to view it. The other ones, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, were they just had to fall in line now, because obviously for the UAE, it would look tremendously bad if in the context of the Saudis making a concession and showing goodwill and good faith in negotiations, if now the Emiratis had said to the Americans, no, we're not interested in this. And that would have left the Emiratis even more isolated than the Emiratis were in 2014 in the last crisis. So I would still make the case that the Emiratis are fairly isolated, because the Saudis are now post-Trump, every Gulf state is fending for itself. Every Gulf state has to take care of its own national interests. And the Saudis are fighting for themselves in the same way that the Emiratis are fighting for themselves. And in this context, this kind of strong alliance that we've seen emerging throughout the Gulf conflict between UAE and Saudi has been somewhat watered down. And at the moment, the Riyadh is saying we need to do what's best for us. Abu Dhabi is saying we have to do what's best for us. And in this context, the Qataris have basically come out and said, you know, we've actually, we're doing what's best for us as well. And we got away with not making any major concessions. And that's where we're at. And the biggest problem that I want to get, this last point I want to make here is, this is a crisis. This crisis is a symptom, right? This blockade is a symptom of a much deeper conflict, which I said was ideological. That conflict still persists. This conflict hasn't been addressed. And it is most likely that it might reemerge to a third episode of that conflict with another crisis down the line. I wouldn't say not in the short to mid-term, but potentially in the long term, because the issues, especially between Abu Dhabi and Doha, remain. None of it has been addressed. They are being pragmatic. Everybody's being pragmatic at the moment because of the changes in Washington, because of external factors, because of internal factors. And so it remains a fragile piece. And in some of these proxy conflicts in Libya, for example, we'll see Qatar and the UAE on opposite sides. And the same is true in the Horn of Africa as well, where I think, you know, Qatari interests and Emirati interests are clashing, and that won't go away.
Which leads me on to my final question, which is of a more sports-specific nature. One view that it was put to me recently is that this is going to be a short-lived truce, because once the World Cup is over, it will flare again. And I guess, Andreas, you've already touched upon that. But Kristian, either specifically related to the World Cup or to other instances relating to sport, looking forward, what do you see the GCC agreement last week meaning for the World Cup, for football club ownership, for the staging of Formula One races, for the way in which these countries compete to host events? What do you see happening? What will come next?
Well, ironically, we also had Qatar and Saudi Arabia going head-to-head in December for the 2030 Asian Games hosting. And in that occasion, Qatar won the vote for 2030, and Saudi Arabia will host the Games in 2034. And a lot was said about the Saudis wanting the Asian Games for 2030 because it meets their Vision 2030. The Qataris also have a Vision 2030 as well. So for both sides, 2030 was a big year just because of their longer range economic visions. So they went head to head in that aspect of the Asian Games. It was largely non-controversial, I'd say. I think it was part of this gradual process of reconciliation. I think going forward with the World Cup, it's going to be a boon, obviously, that citizens of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, they'll want to travel. I mean, these are football mad countries. Had the World Cup taken place in Qatar and the Saudi, Bahraini or Emirati governments not allowed their citizens or residents to go to the games when they were on their doorstep, it would have been a problem for them, because people would have wanted to have gone. The whole mantra for hosting the World Cup in the Middle East was it was a World Cup for the region, for the Arab world, for the Middle East.
And obviously Egypt too, Kristian.
Well, yes, Egypt as well. And of course, Egypt and Saudi Arabia may well qualify. They have in the past qualified for World Cups. Bahrain, UAE perhaps are less likely, but the UAE played in Italy in 1990. I remember watching them against West Germany. So there will be a demand to take part in the World Cup, to volunteer, I think, for the World Cup as volunteers. Football fans might choose to stay in Dubai and travel to Doha for games on game days. That would be a boon for Dubai's economy, which is struggling even before the pandemic. But I think especially as we move into an eventual post-pandemic future, Dubai and Abu Dhabi will need a boost to their economy. And so any gain they can get from hosting fans for the World Cup, flying in and out, would benefit them. So I think in the short term, the World Cup can at least bring the region together, at least over a shared common interest. Again, what happens after that is another issue. And of course, I share Andreas and your skepticism is necessarily a long-term truth. I think maybe something won't necessarily happen until the Biden administration is replaced by something else in the US. And I agree completely with Andreas that this crisis of 2017 was really driven by the fact that in the US you had a highly unconventional president taking office. And I think as long as we have the Biden administration, or one making it very clear that there's no room for regional kind of adventures like this will keep things in check. So I think we have 4 more years of at least some certainty and predictability. And within that, the Gulf states will all compete with each other for hosting events. As you said, there's already now, I think, a 3rd Formula One race in the Gulf that will take place in Saudi Arabia, and just to those in Abu Dhabi and Bahrain. Athletics events have happened in the Gulf recently, golf and tennis. There's never been, I mean, this has been one aspect of the GCC where the states have competed against each other. There's never been a GCC or Gulf-wide agreement to sort of work together and sort of almost allocate events to one another states. And I suspect this will just continue. And in a post-pandemic environment where investment in sport from traditional investors might fall away just because there's less money to go around. If the Gulf states, and of course they've also been hit very hard by the pandemic, but if they're the ones still investing in sports, buying football teams or hosting events, that could make them even more prominent just because other potential investors or hosts might fall away just because they're trying to recover from the economic shock over the last year.
The interesting one for me is that bids will have to go in soon for the right to host 2032 Olympic Games, and a bid announcement should be made in 2024. So already Qatar and Saudi Arabia have both expressed an interest in bidding for and winning the right to stage 2032 Olympics. So that is an interesting one. Andreas, is there anything that you would highlight in sporting terms that you think we should be now looking out for? For instance, do you think Saudi Arabian investors will circle back round for a Newcastle United or a Premier League club?
There are certainly rumors coming out of Saudi Arabia that this is an opportunity now, that the whole be in sport scandal has somewhat evaporated, and that the countries are now more, even if they're not supportive of Saudi moves in sports, at least them being quiet gives them more freedom to maneuver. I could imagine that in this year or next year, the Saudis might start a second round, and that goes for other issues as well. I mean, the Saudis want to attract business, they want to attract sporting events, they want to attract international visitors, and having the countries as a supporting partner or a quiet partner is still more beneficial than having the countries on the other side. And I do think that there is an expectation, I think, in Saudi Arabia that the countries will help legitimize somewhat Saudi as an equal partner in that domain. There's also something else. COVID-19, I think, has showed how vulnerable Western democracies are. It has shown how vulnerable we are in the West, but including Japan with the Olympics, in terms of fending this pandemic off. And on average, the GCC countries have done a lot better. Certainly, they're much smaller countries. They have more assets. They have smaller populations. They're very rich countries. They are more they're autocracies. They have less civil liberties to worry about. But in terms of hosting sporting events, the fact that, for example, the Australian Formula One race will now be, or the start of the season of the Formula One will not take place in Australia, but in Bahrain, shows you that, there might be, these are safer environments to actually host these kind of events. Unlike other Middle Eastern locations, there's more physical security. There is less vulnerability or volatility in terms of social politics, so we don't have to worry about some coup d'etat or something like that. At least that's true for most of them. But if you look at the big three, if you look at Saudi, UAE, and Qatar, big, in inverted commas. But if you look at these three, I think they have a very good post-pandemic portfolio to show in terms of the infrastructure they have, in terms of the security they can provide, and also in terms of public health. They're able to take care of this situation a lot more efficiently than we can. So I think there are a lot of opportunities that arise for all the 6 GCC, but definitely the big three in terms of sports, attracting events, attracting also obviously attracting influencers from the sporting world to come and either play for a year in a club in Saudi, play for a year in Qatar or the UAE. And we shouldn't also forget that last year? No, 2019 in the Asian Cup. It was, Qatar won the Asian Cup. Qatar has made immense progress in terms of football. Obviously, they're nowhere near where they want to be, but if you look at the relatively short time span, Qatar has made a lot of progress, and I do think these countries with the right targeted investment in developing infrastructure, developing capacity and capability, they will eventually be able to compete on an international level, and we've seen that already. So that will make them even more attractive for other sporting clubs, sporting events, and so on to come to the Gulf.
Okay, so Kristian, thank you. Andreas, thank you very much. For people who've watched this webinar, hopefully you understand rather more about the historic and more recent history of what's been happening in the Gulf region, specifically the GCC. And thanks for sharing your insights on sport. As you know, my particular interest in the region is from a sporting perspective, and there were things that you said there I really had not thought about. So that was for me really insightful. So can I thank you for joining us, and thank people for watching the webinar, and hopefully you'll access some of the other webinars and pieces that are published on the GeoSport website. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.